Well, today we continue our Lenten series, Wandering Hearts, Figuring Out Faith with Peter. And this morning, we find Peter once again on the water, in a boat, after a long night. And I want to thank our liturgical arts ministry for setting this beautiful lake-like scene on our communion table again this week. Although I imagine the beautiful waters that we see here are probably a lot nicer than the waters that Jesus and the disciples experienced that night. The story of Jesus walking on water is one of the most well-known stories in the Gospels, even beyond Christian circles. And we hear images and phrases from this story in everyday conversation. O ye of little faith. And it's not like she walks on water. But you know what we don't often talk about with this story? How Peter walked on water too. Maybe you missed it. Maybe you noticed it for the first time today since we're so focused on Peter. But after Jesus tells them to take heart, it is I, do not be afraid, Peter takes that charge seriously. But not before he wants to confirm Jesus' identity, have him prove that it's really him. Jesus, one of his closest companions, his teacher, his friend, the one that he spent almost every night and day with since he dropped his nets and followed him, the man that he watched heal person after person and just to feed 5,000 people, like Katie said, with 5 loaves and 2 fish, the one who said, "It is I." This is who he challenges to test and see if it's really him? Why would Peter do that? Let's rewind a bit. The day prior, Jesus and Peter and the disciples had learned that one of Jesus' oldest companions, a member of his family, his cousin, the one who baptized him, John, had died a horrible death. He was beheaded while he was in prison. How would we feel if Alvaro went back to El Salvador and was imprisoned for his human rights activism, and then we had gotten word that he was beheaded? That's awful, right? This is what Jesus and Peter and the disciples are experiencing. This is what they're dealing with, an unimaginable loss of their friend and their teacher. So I can only empathize with the fact that Jesus wanted to get away and spend some time alone to process what he had just learned. But when he went to what he thought was a deserted beach, a great crowd had gathered. They were hungry. They were tired. They were sick. And even in his own grief, Jesus took time to heal the sick and to feed the crowds with the help of the disciples. I wonder what that day was like for Peter, trying to navigate his own emotions around this horrible news of John's execution, while also worrying about Jesus. Not only the pain that he was experiencing, but he had to to question, would he suffer the same fate? Would they all suffer the same fate? When would the empire come after them? What could they do? Jesus, like a good teacher, like a good leader, knew that he needed time and space to process. And so he made Peter and the disciples get on a boat and go ahead to the other side. And they listened to him. They honored his request for this time and space to himself. Now, as we've just heard, the disciples have already had a whirlwind of a day, and now they were sent away from Jesus, everyone carrying so much pain, to face a very difficult night. The boat rising and falling. You can just imagine that. Has anyone ever been on a ship when you've hit a storm or even just a little bit of waves? Imagine that, but tenfold. It's rising. The waves are crashing in all around, tossing them from side to side, up and down, all night long. I can barely take 45 minutes of turbulence on a plane. I'm sure they were exhausted, disoriented, and seasick. Is it any surprise that as the day breaks and they see a figure on the water, they think it's a ghost? I mean, how can they even see clearly after a night like that? A few weeks ago, after tossing and turning for a couple of hours, I finally had fallen asleep. When I was woken up by the sound of someone fumbling around my house, immediately my adrenaline shot through the roof. How did they get in? Did I forget to lock the door? Can I quietly get up and lock the door to my bedroom? Where was my phone? I sat up. I looked around, and I saw a person down the hallway in the kitchen. Wait, that's not where the kitchen is in my house. It took me a few seconds to realize that I wasn't at my house. I was at my sister's house. No one had broken in. My niece was just in the kitchen filling up her water bottle. I was tired. I was confused. I was disoriented. I didn't immediately recognize the figure in front of me. When are you most likely to mistake someone as a threat or as a ghost coming your way when they are actually a companion? Peter and the disciples were naturally worried that Jesus was a threat after the storm they had just been through. They had been afraid all night long. Why would that suddenly go away in the morning? And yet, as they cried out in fear, Jesus offers them comfort and encouragement. Take heart. It is I. Do not be afraid. This isn't the first time that Jesus offers these words of comfort, offers this command, take heart. You know, the Greek verb used here is tharsio, which actually means show courage. And Jesus says this when he heals a paralytic, when he heals a blind man, when he heals a mother and a daughter. He says it when he foretells his own death. He tells his good friend Peter, his disciple, show courage. And Peter does. That is what's so beautiful about this story. Peter shows courage. He steps out of the boat. He walks towards Jesus. He walks on water. After the day and the night that he had just experienced, he shows trust and bravery in a way I can't even imagine. He literally steps out in courage. That's not something we talk about a lot with this story. Peter's courage. We tend to focus on the next part, when Peter becomes frightened and starts to sink and cries out for Jesus to save him. And when Jesus reaches out, we have that famous line, "Oh, ye of little faith, why did you doubt?" When Hurricane Harvey hit southeast Texas in 2017, it rained and it rained and it rained and it rained for 4 days straight, dumping over 50 inches of water, becoming the largest rain event in U.S. history. I had a friend who lived in Houston, several actually at the time, and she said that for the next year, whenever it would start to rain, even just a sprinkle, she would find herself crippled with anxiety and close to a panic attack. Of course, Peter became frightened, following the strong winds that caused him to lose focus. He was just in a horrible storm. Who wouldn't have been distracted by a strong gust of wind? There are good reasons for us to be afraid, just like Peter. And no amount of positive thinking or hard work can make the storms of life less terrifying. Peter not only courageously stepped out of the boat, he bravely sought connection when he felt himself sinking. He grabbed Jesus' hand and let him rescue him from danger. And that word for doubt, distazo, it means going two ways. So Jesus is simply asking, why are you wavering? I'm here. Be brave. You've got this. This question of doubt in the passage today has unfortunately been weaponized. It's been used as a tool of shame, which I don't believe was Jesus' intention at all. Isn't it a good thing to have friends that push us to be brave, that believe in us, even when we don't believe in ourselves? And isn't doubt a part of growth? Jesus didn't judge or shame Peter. He reached out to save him and assured him to not be afraid. He showed through his actions that Peter could trust him and believe in him who was a friend and as God enfleshed. So I invite you to think about, when have you found yourself vulnerable or exposed? When have you felt like you were sinking in the middle of a storm? What has thrown you off balance? What did you do in those moments? Did you cry out for help? Did you try to navigate the storm by yourself? Did someone reach out to rescue you? Dr. Terence Lester writes, sometimes we sink simply because we had the courage to show up. Sometimes we sink because we lose sight of what's crashing around us. That first step out of the boat that Peter took was probably the scariest. But it was the moment that he chose that the risk was worth it. What does it look like for us to hold sacred space? Sacred space in which we can name our fears and then courageously step out of the boat. Courage is a muscle that must be exercised, both at an individual level and also as a collective community. We must be sharing and listening and holding and tending our fears together. Because if we don't, how else will we be able to reach out and extend a hand when needed? How else will we hear people cry, "Help me"? How else will we see when someone is struggling? The reality of life is that we always face danger. Emotional, spiritual, relational, professional, physical, and global. And the reality of our faith is that we don't face these fears alone. We are living in a time that calls for courage, working towards those first steps and knowing and accepting that more than likely we're probably going to sink is part of the journey. But take heart, because God is near, walking towards us in the chaos, extending their hand when the storms of life are engulfing us. And God is using us to do the same to others. Amen.